Y'all have been ready to start for like 5 minutes. I can tell. And now it's time to start. Before we start, I want to thank Lance for jumping in for me last Sunday on short notice. There's nothing like getting a text message at 2 a.m. from the guy in a hospital waiting room that's supposed to teach class the following morning, but I'm sure he handled it with great grace, and yeah, so I appreciate that. I hated to spring that on him at the last minute. And I'm still technically covering for him, so I'm going to plug along here at least for this week and next week, and then I think he'll be back for at least one more week. We got to figure that out going forward, but I'm planning this week and next week. Turn to Luke 7. That's where we're going to be at this morning. We're going to look at the first couple of paragraphs, first couple of stories there at the beginning of Luke 7. And we've shifted back into a kind of narrative part of Luke's story, where the majority of chapter 6 was more about that teaching, that Sermon on the Mount, like Luke's account of the Sermon on the Mount. And now it's shifting back into a more narrative account, and we'll see what we do with that, how it actually connects maybe to what we studied the past couple weeks. I'm not sure. It almost feels like there's a little bit of a shift. But that, that's the fun part of this, is trying to think about how it connects, and we'll do that as we go. I want to look at verses 1 through 10 to start. Is anybody feeling like reading this morning? No hands. Yeah, 1 through 10. Randy, thank you.
When he had completed all his discourse in the hearing of the people, he went to Capernaum. And a certain centurion slave, who was highly regarded by him, was sick and about to die. And when he heard about Jesus, he sent some Jewish elders, asking him to come and save the life of his slave. And when they had come to Jesus, they earnestly entreated him, saying, "He is worthy for you to grant this to him, for he loves our nation, and it was he who built us our synagogue." Now Jesus started on his way with them, and when he was already not far from the house, the centurion sent friends, saying to him, "Lord, do not trouble yourself further, for I am not worthy for you to come under my roof. For this reason I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you. But just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I too am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. And I say to this one, go, and he goes. And I say to another, come, and he comes. And to my slave, do this, and he does it." Now when Jesus heard this, he marveled at him, and turned and said to the multitude that was following him, "I say to you, not even in Israel have I found such great faith." And when those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the slave in good health.
Okay, thanks, Randy. Let's start by just kind of soaking in the details. I think we did this a couple weeks ago. Just like, what are the details that are jumping off at the page at you, whether they're notable or just otherwise? Before we kind of get into our questions and interpreting and all that, just what happened here? What are the facts on the page as we're looking at them?
First thing is Jesus has returned to Capernaum.
Okay, so we're in Capernaum.
As soon as he enters Capernaum, messengers from the synagogue know the centurion come to him, asking him for help.
Okay, we got the Jewish elders coming to Jesus on behalf of the centurion asking for help. What do they need help with? Okay, we need a healing for the centurion? Okay, slave. What did you say, Kathy?
For his servant.
Yeah, servant. Okay, what else? What are our other details here?
The centurion never meets him.
The centurion never meets Jesus, okay. Yeah, and Luke's telling of the story. If Matthew's telling the story, it's a little different, but we're not That's another story for another time. We don't need to talk about that today, but it's an interesting connection. Luke tells us they never meet. Yeah. Other details that you find interesting?
It's interesting that a Gentile Roman oppressor is viewed as someone who loves the nation of Israel and provides for it.
Okay. Gentile Roman oppressor. That is who he is. Let's pin that thought, Randy. I like where you're going with it. Let's hold on to that one for a minute. But it is interesting, the specific people involved here. Other facts of the story, other details.
The centurion loved the Jewish people and even built their synagogue.
Yeah, he's loved the Jewish people, built the synagogue, benefactor in a lot of ways. He seems to be one of the good guys. At least that's how they maybe kind of present him. It's an interesting, I think that's an interesting detail. Other details, other facts of the story.
Jesus spoke saying, this man had more faith than the Jewish people, all of Israel. So maybe Jesus knew that he was there to die for them.
Yeah, the statement, it's a really powerful statement, and we'll maybe dwell on that a little bit later, but Jesus marveled and said, I haven't found faith like this in all of Israel. It's interesting considering all of those Sabbath incidents that we just read about. He's, fresh in his mind, like, yeah, this guy's getting it. Well, nobody else seems to. Other details. There's one big detail nobody's mentioned yet. He wanted help with the healing. Was he disappointed? No. It happened. It happened. This servant that was near the point of death recovered. How?
His faith.
Okay. It's weird. It doesn't really say.
Well, didn't we just learn in the previous that Nazareth didn't have faith, so he wasn't able to heal in that city, and he left and said that?
Yeah, I don't remember that. It might be. My point is, it never says, Jesus said, hey, you servant, get better. It just, they get back and they find him healed. It's really an interesting way that it happened. And we're not really told the mechanism. There's so many times that we don't really get a mechanism for that happening. Like the guy with the hand. Jesus just basically says, hold out your hand. And it's healed. He didn't say abracadabra, something. It just kind of happened. Randy, then Kathy.
I think too in verse 6 where he talks about, I guess under 8, where he talks about his authority and whatnot, he makes a comparison to himself and Jesus in regards to having the ability to have authority and recognizing Jesus' authority by being able to mirror it with his. By recognizing the authority of Jesus, I think that would be the thing that's how faith is articulated in that moment. So it's by recognizing the authority of Jesus that the faith is made known.
Yeah. Kathy, go ahead.
And it doesn't say that the servant had any faith at all. It was the centurion.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting incident. Usually Jesus seems to have so many reasons for doing what he does, and sometimes it seems really clear. The point of this seems to be the centurion's faith, but somebody else got the healing, which doesn't seem to happen very often. But we're going to see in our next story that I think it's even really less evident what the point is at face value. So just interesting to kind of soak these details in. Let's shift from those details, and I can see you guys starting to sort of piece things together and ask questions and interpret a little bit. But things we should make of this, I don't want to go any farther before we all just stop and tell me if you experience this. For those of you that have been reading these stories your whole life, you kind of get used to them. This is healing from sickness, and not just any sickness, right? What do we know about it?
He's about to die.
He's about to die. Like, this is real. It's fatal. It seems like there's an urgency to this. It's not just bad food or something like that. It's, this guy's going to die. So let's let this soak in for a second. Jesus heals this really imperative, fatal disease from a distance. He never saw the servant. He has no information about the illness that we can gather. And maybe he never even spoke a word. At least that's not what Luke... And you would think Luke, being the doctor, the physician, would have really wanted to gather up some of these details, right? And the only words that Jesus speaks is to the crowd. He doesn't say anything like, okay, go on back, you'll find something good when you get back there. They just get back and they find him. So I want us to soak in the amazingness of this for a minute, because I kind of get used to it. But we should let it be real. Very real thing. Lance?
Another thing is, when Jesus says, I tell you, I've not found such great faith in Israel. How did he identify the centurion's faith? What was it the centurion, the centurion didn't say, oh, I believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. It wasn't, that's not the faith that he demonstrates here.
Well, hold on, let's pin it. I like what you're thinking, but I think to understand the centurion, we need to look at something else real fast. It's a good question. There's a lot more to the story, I think, than kind of meets the eye. Randy?
Another interesting detail is that when the Jewish elders come to him, they make the declaration to Jesus that this man is worthy, without letting Jesus make the determination that this man is worthy.
Let's work on that. Do you have any more thoughts on that?
Just an observation.
I think these guys are really interesting, and I never really thought about it very much until I was preparing for this lesson. I read something that made me think, oh, I thought those were good guys. Everybody feel like these are good guys here? Anybody want to argue against them? I'm going to give you that chance. Derek, you look like you want to.
They're running messages for their own oppressors.
Okay. And what about that is?
It's like adjacent to the active worker, right? They're working for the occupying power.
Okay. And they come with this message, you need to heal this guy because the centurion is worthy. Why?
Because he did good stuff for us, and we like him, and we want to keep continuing his good graces.
It seems like such a strange detail to say, he has built our synagogue. He's worthy. To link those two things together. It doesn't seem so altruistic to me. I never really thought about that before, but the more I read this, the more I think, yeah, that's actually it. These guys were looking at this physical situation and saying, he's nice to us, so you should be nice to him. He's worthy. He's a wealthy donor. I don't know. It's just, if it was so altruistic, it'd be really weird, to Derek's point, that this is actually one of the rare instances of this harmony existing between the Jews and the Gentiles, and very specifically the Gentile Roman oppressor, as Randy said. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't mean it couldn't happen. It just doesn't seem to make sense. And so I'm leaning toward this, they've got some ulterior motives here. They want to keep this guy happy because he's nice to them and because he takes care of them. And that's their basis for saying, He deserves it. Now let's reach back to one of the teachings on the Sermon on the Mount, specifically that paragraph in chapter 6, 27 through 36. If you have those subheadings in your Bible, it's the love your enemies section. But very specifically, verse 32. If you love those who love you, what benefit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. With that fresh in mind, Jesus is approached by people that say, well, he's nice to us, so you should be nice to him. It just seems too perfect of an illustration of what Jesus is talking about here. And instead, what we find, that whole point of that text in chapter 6 is Jesus says, do better. You can do better. How better? Well, be merciful as your Father is merciful. The Gentile Roman oppressor, regardless, isn't worthy, but he is worthy by that measuring stick. And so it feels like it's them kind of, you get these guys as kind of this sort of deliberate counterpoint to then the centurion, who, we look at the details, you have that first group come up to Jesus. Hey, you need to do this. It reads like Jesus is traveling with them through the city, and somehow word must have got back to the centurion that he's coming. Well, another group of people come and stop him, and then we get this really interesting message that's recorded in verse 6 and following. And let's just read it again so that it's in our head. This is the second message from the centurion as Jesus is coming to his house. He says, Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. Therefore, I did not presume to come to you, but say the word and let my servant be healed. For I too am a man set under authority with soldiers under me, and I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he does it. So, it doesn't change the request for healing, but he completely, with the background of these Jewish elders in mind, what does he then do?
He humbles himself.
Yeah, explain that a little bit more, Becky. What are you seeing that makes you think that?
When they came to Jesus, they're like, come do this, this guy's worthy. And he comes, when he comes to Jesus, he says the words to Jesus, I am not worthy for you to come to my house. He recognizes that, he recognizes that Jesus is the power of Jesus. Who he really is, and he knows.
Yeah.
But to admit that to Jesus, I think that's the statement of faith. That Jesus said, I have not seen faith like this at all. I think that's the moment.
Okay. And this is a guy that could claim, he mentions his authority, but he doesn't mention it in a way to shove it in Jesus' face. He's just saying, I know how to speak to direct those under my charge. This sickness is under your charge, so you know how to speak to it. You don't need to come here, and I trust that you can do that. But it's all in the posture of, I'm not worthy. I didn't presume to speak to you in such a way. I didn't even expect you to come under the roof of my house. You can just say the word, and I believe that. Randy?
An interesting aspect of the authority thing that we're looking at here is that the centurion has the power in an occupied country to have the power of life and death. Okay? And when he makes allusion to the fact that he has authority, he is making the allusion to the fact that when I tell a person to come or go, that's subordinate to the fact that I have the power of life and death. And when he says that Jesus is not worthy to come under his roof, he's declaring that the authority that Jesus possesses exceeds his ability to have the power of life and death. That's a pretty bold statement.
Yeah, this is a guy with position and power. He could appeal to Jesus on that, and it's not there, Lance. Do you have a hand?
I was going to, yeah.
Go ahead.
Back in verse 33 of chapter 6, that you didn't read it, you stopped just before there. If you do good to those who are good to you, what credit is that to you? And I think there's a contrast here between the Jewish people and the centurion. The Jewish people wanted to do good to the centurion because he had done good to them. And you have to stop and think, why was the centurion good to them? Was it because they had been good to him? And the answer is probably not. They probably hated him. And so you get this picture here when Jesus says, I haven't seen faith like this in all of Israel. Here's a Roman centurion that's actually putting into practice what Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount. And God's own people don't do that. I just really hadn't seen that, so I appreciate you bringing this discussion up. It's good stuff.
Yeah, I read something that just tweaked exactly how I thought about it, because it was always in my mind just like, hey, these are nice guys. Look at them being so nice to him. No, I don't think so. There's maybe a few other things in trying to unpack, like, why is this such a commendable request? Well, the centurion's disposition is there. There could be an element of respect to this understanding of Jewish contact with Gentiles. You know, when he says, I didn't even expect you to come under my roof, that could have very much been I respect how you guys like to stay away from us, which I think is notable. We had alluded to this before, but he's not asking for anything for himself. This is his faith being demonstrated for the good of another person. And that also, I feel like, is kind of a facet of this whole dimension. His humility is seen throughout. Yeah, I think when it comes down to it, we're looking at this story about grace and mercy. Nothing deserved, nothing demanded. It's just an appeal to the one with the power to heal sickness. Randy?
Just another thought is that, that centurion slave could have very well been Jew.
Yeah. And that's an interesting thought, considering there's another interesting connection to a larger story of Scripture. Remember the story of Naaman in 2 Kings 5? If you think about that, I think it highlights so much more the centurion's attitude, because remember when Naaman was sent with that letter by the king of Syria to the king of Israel, and then on to Elisha. There's gifts of money and clothing. There's this letter from the king, and when he doesn't really get the answer that he is expecting, he expected this bigger show and this cleaner river for him to get his leprosy healed, and it was just not at all what he expected. But you see, like, the pomp and the circumstance and the sort of big showiness of it all kind of expected, and you almost can't miss that in comparison to this centurion and how they're so much more different. In Naaman's, the reason you made me think of that, Randy, was in Naaman's story, the servant girl that told him about the man of God, I think was an Israelite, maybe. So, yes, there could be that Jewish connection there. Remember that Elisha reference in Naaman, because I think that's important to people of Jesus' day thinking about what Jesus is doing. And we're going to see that again here in a moment. Anybody want to wrestle with that statement of Jesus a little bit more? I haven't seen faith like this in all of Israel. You feel like we get a better understanding of that now? Does anybody want to... Go ahead, Don. Go ahead.
There's kind of a question here with, starts in 3, that they sent Jewish elders. And then down in 6, it says centurion sent friends. And then when Jesus was close to the house, he stopped him, didn't want him to come into the house. And then there's when those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the slave in good health. And there seems to be a distance from where the healing took place, but it also sounds like a crowd had gathered around Jesus to give the centurion a petition to Jesus that, and yet Jesus was on a path going a different way, and all these people gathered around him to give the centurion's, servant is dying, please help him. And then it's just, okay, fine, I'll do it. And centurion never went back to the house. The friends went on their way. Jesus went on his way. And it was just like a flicker of a moment in time.
Yeah.
A lot of people were involved in this.
Yeah, good observation. Anybody want to take a shot at how we can have this same faith today? Practically speaking.
Prayer, powerful. And we never see the results, maybe.
Yeah, maybe never see the results of our prayer. Big asks. Sometimes we might just, I'm pulling this from something I read online, but sometimes we might just pray for what's merely humanly possible instead of praying for long distance healing without even with only saying the word. And really believe in it when we ask for it. Candy.
Also like an aspect of maybe asking without feeling like you deserve it or someone deserves it. Because he was not someone of Israel, and Jesus not only didn't let it stop him, but he recognized the faith, So even someone that we feel like is not in a place where they're right with God, even if we're not in a place where we're right with God, it shouldn't stop us from asking big without any limitations.
Yeah. Complete and total unworthiness is where we all stand before God, so it shouldn't stop us from asking. Maybe just to make that simple. Other thoughts? I think I have trouble maybe grasping just how much the centurion was really humble. Enough to the point that Jesus says, yeah. And the thing is, he said it to the crowd. It's almost like a backhanded compliment, like, wow, I haven't seen faith like this in a while, maybe ever. To the crowd behind him.
And he says, in all Israel, to Israel.
Yeah. Okay, let's keep moving along. Keep that in our minds, and we're going to read another story that is another healing story, but this moment in time that you were talking about, Donna, I can't believe how momentous this next story is, and it's almost just told as it's short. So soak in the details. We'll talk about these. Anybody feeling up for reading verses 11 through 17? You're going to get me. Okay, you got me. Verse 11. Soon afterward, he went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a great crowd went with him. As he drew near to the gate of the town, behold, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and a considerable crowd from the town was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her, and said to her, "Do not weep." Then he came up and touched the bier, and the bearers stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." And the dead man sat up and began to speak. And Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized them all, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has arisen among us, and God has visited his people." And this report about him spread through the whole of Judea and all the surrounding country. What are our details here?
We're approaching the town of Nain.
Okay. Different town.
This was an unsolicited email.
He just does it, right? Unsolicited. Yeah, that's a good detail. Thank you.
He raised the dead.
Yeah, and the amount of time it took you to say he raised the dead is the amount of time it took me to read that story, basically. It's over. Just basically, again, Luke, the physician, you think you'd be like, where's the medical explanation for this? Maybe he didn't have one and he just had to tell it simply. But we've got a dead person that came back to life. Anybody seen that happening? No? Yeah. Dead person back to life. Doesn't happen. Randy, you had your hand up. Details here.
I was going to make a comment. Nobody asked him except for the compassion that Jesus had. I mean, that's the thing that we see. It says that he felt compassion for her. And so her grief was the motivator that caused him to feel that compassion.
Okay. We'll come back to that. Other details here, Candy?
This story actually really strikes me as Jesus crossing into a lot of territory that he didn't need to, usually wouldn't have, because he enters into the funeral party. He goes up and talks to a woman, which was unusual. He tells her, don't cry, which I don't know about that society, but in our society, for a man to go up to a grieving woman and talk to her and commiserate with her was, over a boundary, still is kind of.
Mm-hmm.
And then he touches the thing that's holding the dead body, which would have made him ceremonially unclean, and he didn't even know this family. So the movement of his heart, which is kind of unusual that, that is mentioned, his emotions are brought in. The movement of his heart causes him to cross this barrier and bring this young man back over to his mother. So that's what strikes me best.
Yeah, and I don't know if it makes a difference for the cleanliness stuff. He touches the platform that the body's on. He doesn't touch the body until it's back to life, which I find really interesting. Again, there are so many times where these guys wanted to accuse him of something for breaking some kind of law, and he never really does it. He breaks their interpretations, or he never, it's like there's always, he knows just enough what to do, where if somebody said, you're unclean, he's like, I didn't touch the body until it was alive. So even those little details are fascinating to me too. I think Candy kind of summed up a lot of these features of this really well. Let's just follow some of these lines of thinking here for a minute. First of all, again, let's soak into the reality that Jesus just raised a guy from the dead. First, he kept somebody from dying who was close to dying. There was sickness healed. Now we're talking about death. Literally the hardest thing to do. And he was really dead. It wasn't like they were all sitting at the house waiting it's going to happen any second now. They probably got him covered up, wrapped up. He's on this bier. They're carrying him out. And you get the sense that this crowd with them is people that are mourning. And I just love the detail of the dead man sat up. And what did he do? Yeah, he started talking. I wonder what he said. I've been thinking about this from his perspective. What was he experiencing? Some of you heard that I had a little incident with food poisoning on Thursday night. I passed out 3 times. And that's the weirdest thing if you've ever just totally blacked out to come out of it. Your mind is doing some weird things as you're coming out of that. And I'm is that what it was like for him? Or was it just, I don't know. But what do you say? Did he have his full wits about him? Whoa, hey guys, I thought we were in the house. How'd we get out here? I don't know. I have so many questions. But anyways, dead person back to life. Crazy details. Let it feel real. Question it, doubt it, believe it. This is what we're called to do with texts like this. Because up to this point, Jesus ain't done anything like this, not in Luke's account. And as quickly as that story's told, it doesn't change the realness of what he did. So we need to try to capture the sense of amazement that should come with this story. Okay, Randy, you answered a question that I had. Why did Jesus do this? And you settled on compassion. Does anybody have any other thoughts about why we have this story? Why it's recounted? You got more, Randy, go ahead.
Yeah, I kind of do, but as we read on a little further here in this chapter, when John the Baptist asked for a report and whatnot, one of the things that Jesus tells the people who give him the report is the fact that the dead rise.
Yeah.
And so what he's doing by raising the dead here is he is fully affirming himself as the person that John the Baptist is looking for. And so all of these things are happening prior to the statement occurring, and they're happening in a way that allows all of these things to come to being, so that when John asks for the report, as he's about to be executed himself ultimately, he wants to know that who he's handing this off to is in fact the one that's going to do what God's purpose is.
Yeah, it's hard to see the story isolated when you know what's coming, and I think we'll connect it backwards in a second also, but just as a standalone story, it's a powerful, amazing story, but it's also kind of like, why? I do want to focus in on that compassion element, because the story is, it paints a picture of sadness, doesn't it? If you just read it slower than I read it a few minutes ago. The dead man was the only son of a widow. A lady's been through a lot of loss. Jesus has compassion. I looked up that Greek word, and it carries this meaning of like being moved deeply in the inward parts, is the way the definition read. So that is like this very deep feeling. And then he tells her not to weep. And to Candy's point, if you're going to do that, you better have a good reason for telling a widow who's just lost her only son not to cry. So she's crying. She's clearly in grief. And then I don't know, maybe this is just, there's an interesting phrase after verse 15, the dead man sat up, began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. It's almost like, I have trouble reading this because at one point it calls him a man, and then that image to me shows kid. So I don't really know, but this image of do not weep, he's alive now. I don't know, it's just, there are really like emotional threads woven through this. She doesn't ask for healing. Jesus makes no statement about faith. It just is very different from these other miracles that Jesus has been doing. The level of severity, dead man back to life. Amazing. It's unprecedented. And you would think there would be some kind of like, he who has ears to hear, let him hear kind of statement like Jesus usually does. There's nothing like that. It all seems to be geared right back to the emotional element, this compassion. And I think that's interesting. Jesus taking the initiative unsolicited, only in response to her grief. And for those of us that have trouble with our emotions, it's a really good lesson to think about how we relate to other people. Annette, go ahead. Annette, then Lance.
It just reminds me of how Jesus calls all of us, before we came to him in faith, he calls us to get up and believe, and calls us to a life of salvation. And the man had to do something. He had to sit up, and we have to accept the call to, the gift of salvation and to walk with Jesus, or we can just stay dead. And over and over in my faith, after coming to faith, I have felt the Lord call. Okay, time to get up again. You're kind of getting, complacent, things like that, or I'm calling you to something else. So that's what this reminds me of. And God, I think weeps for all of those. It says that do not come to him. The mother was weeping for him being dead.
Yeah, thank you. There's some really good imagery there. Anytime we see death to life imagery, our antenna better start perking up.
I was going to say, Jesus has been telling, the kingdom of God is here. It's nearby. And when he teaches his disciples to pray, it's that God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And miracles, or as John refers to them as signs, pointing to something in the future, when I read this, in Revelation 21, then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. The first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Now the dwelling of God is with men, and he will live with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." I think Jesus is demonstrating that very clearly here in this text.
Okay.
I've just been reading in John exactly what Lance just shared, and it's in 8. He's talking to the Jews. "If God were your father, you would love me, for I proceeded forth and have come from God. For I have not even come on my own initiative, but he sent me." And not very many people, even in the Christian realm, know that they are now the children of God, and he is our Father. And then the other aspect is he ascended to the right hand of God and sent the Holy Spirit to be with us, in us, guide us, seal us, mark us as the adopted children. And I think Jesus brings this in, if you knew me, you would know the Father, and I have what the Father wants to give you. And Randy always accuses me of being a computer zapper. I touch things and things come out of my hands and I destroy things. I don't even know I've done it. And how many of us have power beyond our own capabilities and understanding because God gave them to us?
Yeah. Candy, you had a hand up.
Just a side note that's kind of cool is that the Elijah and Naaman story is very close to the Elisha healing the widow's son. Also just, compassion, only son. So.
Yeah, is the resurrection of a dead son unprecedented in this point in history? Elisha and Elijah both did that. Now, with that in mind, what do these people say, just as the response to this healed boy? A great prophet's come among us. Why do you think they said that? Because they've heard of this happening a couple times before in their history. No, I think they're making those connections right there, Candy, I think, and I think we're meant to do that also. That other statement, God has visited his people, real fast, we've read that in Luke, or at least something similar, when Zechariah was able to talk again, and he talks about God visiting his people. I like clicking on cross-references sometime, and in the Bible program on my computer, one of the cross-references to visiting sent it back to Exodus 4, when Moses comes to the children of Israel for the first time, and they start basically glorifying God because he's visiting his people. The Israelites, who had been waiting for God to come see them while they've been in Egypt for a long time, are getting this promised visitation from the Lord. So I just think that this stuff is loaded with imagery that then they're going, whoa, somebody raised from the dead. And so, of course, the story spreads, the report spreads throughout the whole surrounding country. So we'll leave that there. Alan is going to lead us in a prayer to dismiss us, and thank you all for your time and attention today.
Father, we thank you for our time together this morning. Thank you for Aaron for leading us. We're glad he's feeling better, back on his feet, and able to lead class today. Father, Jesus is just amazing. Of of course, we see that in both of the encounters we looked at today. His wisdom, his love, the strength, the power that he has. Father, we want to be his disciples. We want to follow him. Pray that we don't let anything hinder us from this, and that we are all helping each other along the path, the straight and narrow path that leads him. It's in his name we pray.
This year,